Properly understood, Advent is a time of preparation rather than celebration before Christmas, a seasonal counterpart to Lent prior to Easter. And I know that. I understand it historically, theologically, but even still, after all these years, the Old Testament and Gospel lectionary readings for the first Sunday of Advent never fail to give me something of a jolt. They're not what I'd expect them to be. Keep awake. Stay alert. I get that part. But this first Sunday of Advent is also supposed to be about hope, right? That's the candle that's glowing on our Advent wreath. And yet, apart from keeping awake and staying alert, we're also reading about stars falling from the sky, the sun and the moon going dark, the earth quaking, even heaven itself shaking. That doesn't sound very hopeful. It sounds more like the end of Trump's feud with Kim Jong-un than the beginning of the gospel. What is the connection to the manger in all of this? Where's the silver lining of good news in these ominous clouds that form these verses? I mean, we're reading about nothing less than the shaking, if not the breaking, of the world as we know it. What does that have to do with hope? Well, there's a connection there. It just takes some teasing out and a willingness to go deep. Part of the disconnect, the dissonance even, between these texts and the concept of hope is that, like many of you, I read these texts every year in the splendor and the comfort of a setting like the one that we're in now. I read these texts by the warm-hued light of stained glass, by the glimmer of tinsel wrapped around the tree, and the numerous bows tied around numerous presents underneath that tree. The world as we know it, the established, familiar order of things, it works for me, as it works for many of you. But the truth, the honest, ugly truth, is that the known, established, and familiar order of things, in all of its various manifestations down through time and history, whether we call that order feudalism or imperialism or totalitarianism or communism or, yes, even consumer capitalism, the truth is all of those isms have only ever really worked for relatively few. If you're in the top 20% of Canadian income earners, then life is good. And according to the latest census data, it's only gotten better for you over the last 6 years. You have ample opportunities, your income is up, your prosperity has increased as the nation's has increased. If you're in the other 80%, though, well, things are perhaps not as rosy. Not necessarily bad, but your income is likely stagnant. The rising tide of Canada's increased prosperity has not lifted your boat any higher. And if you live in northern Ontario, especially if you live on a reservation, then you're basically living in another country, a third world country at that. To which you might say, well, preacher, no system is perfect. I mean, we clearly need to improve the lot of our northern countrymen and women, but there are not that many people that live up north. So, percentage-wise, don't you think the system's working pretty good? To which I might reply, It's certainly working a heck of a lot better than it is back in my homeland, where economic disparity is about as stark as it's ever been in the last 125, 150 years. And it looks like it's about to get worse. But let's not just look inside our own borders. Let's zoom out and take a broader view. Let's also not forget about the more than 3 billion with a B, people on our planet who subsist, not live, subsist on $2.50 or less a day. A good portion of them work on the dark side of all of our splendor and our comfort, the side we don't want to see and the side we don't see. I imagine that all of those people on the other side of the current world order, I imagine they would receive these texts very differently from the way that I receive them. I think they would receive them with much less discomfort. And keep in mind, we've only talked about the economic side of the equation. We've said nothing about the sexism, the racism, the xenophobia, and everything else that is also caught up in the current order of things. But for all these billions of people who are fully half, if not more, of the world's population, the shaking, the upending of the known established order is precisely what hope would look like. And this gospel that we embrace here in all of our splendor and our comfort, that we prepare to celebrate at Christmas, has always been honest about this reality. The gospel has been honest about it in ways that we have largely been reluctant to recognize, even though it's right there every year in the story of Jesus' birth. And I know you know this story. But when I say the story, I mean the part before the manger. The part that we read in Luke 1, before we get to Luke 2. Which, if you haven't read that part in a while, I'd really encourage you to read it between now and Christmas Eve. Because that's how we read every other story, right? We read chapter 1 before we read chapter 2. And in this first part of the story, we read about Mary receiving this wonderful news from the angel Gabriel that she is going to become the mother of the Savior of the world. And when she receives this news, she runs to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is also pregnant after a lifetime of infertility. Pregnant with the one whom we will come to know as John the Baptist. And what does Mary do when she and Elizabeth meet? After Elizabeth blesses her, Mary sings. That's what you do at Christmas time, right? You sing. There's nothing else really to do about this wonderful news that we have received. But what does she sing? My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor upon the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. But that's not where it ends. That's just where we cut it off. Her song continues. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and he has sent the rich away empty. Whether we like it or not, or whether we want to admit it or not, Jesus' coming is about God shaking and even breaking the known, established, familiar order of things. That's why Jesus is going to be born in a barn, not in a palace. Because Jesus is being born for all of God's people, not just the select few with power and prestige, connections and access. Because any earthly system, whether we're talking economics or politics or whatever else, any earthly system that turns on power, prestige, connections, access, is a system that necessarily enriches the few and deprives the many. And what all of these systems ultimately deny, what they ultimately deny and distort, is our humanity, the thing that we all have in common. And that distortion happens at every rung along the ladder, every single one. Because as we grow up fixed in these places, as we live and move and have our being in these fixed pecking orders, we start to believe the press that we receive. And the lowly often start to come to think far too lowly of themselves as people because of where they're notched on the ladder. And the high and mighty often come to think far too highly of themselves because of where they're notched on the ladder. The word aristocracy literally means rule by the best. And I see in that term a kind of sick, circular, self-reinforcing logic. We're in charge, so that must mean we're the best. And if we're the best, that means we ought to be in charge. And so the cycle continues. And over time, these systems, they build resentment and they create distance, so that the high and mighty often come to objectify the lowly, and the lowly often come to demonize the high and the mighty. And whichever way it splits, humanity is lost. We stop seeing other people as people. But God's promise to us is that in the kingdom of heaven, that will not be the case. That we will never lose sight of one another's humanity. That in the kingdom of heaven, our humanity will be restored. It must be restored. And that is the connection of these verses to the gospel. Because restoring our humanity, holding a magnifying glass up to it to show us the image of God in every single person, the image of God throughout all creation, regardless of ethnicity or sex or education or income potential or any other worldly measure, in our own eyes and in the eyes of one another. That's not just why Jesus is born in a barn. It's why he is being born at all. To heal us and transform us fully into the image of the divine that is within each and every one of us. To give us life that is abundant here and life that is eternal in the hereafter. And so once we make this connection, we can start to see where the hope lies. And I really see that there's sort of a threefold silver lining to the ominous clouds that are before us today. The first is that what we have in these verses is God's promise that injustice, prejudice, evil, hatred, violence, greed, and all of the other distortions of God's good creation will not triumph. That is God's promise to us. They are and they will be defeated. But that victory ultimately requires a reckoning, even a leveling. It requires mountains to be made low and valleys to be raised up, for rough places to be made smooth and the crooked to be made straight. It requires deserts to be watered and bloom and be turned into fertile land. And that means that all nations and all people on earth will be shaken. The Lord will shake all nations, the earth, and even the heaven. And the gospel is honest about that. And this shaking, this leveling, this reckoning is what Jesus calls us, instructs us to keep awake for, to stay alert for. The second silver lining is this, that even though we are blind to so much of the dark side that we don't see and don't care to see, even though we are sometimes willfully blind, keeping ourselves in the dark behind our hedges and our fences, our gates, the myths and the legends that we tell ourselves to sanitize our past, the gospel declares that the blind can see. Not just can, but will come to see. The gospel is honest about this too. When Jesus begins his ministry in the Gospel of Luke, he quotes the prophet Isaiah, saying, "I have come to release the captives, because the captives can be freed. I have come to proclaim good news to the poor, because there is good news for them to hear. And I have come to restore sight to the blind, because the blind can be made, can be taught how to see." And this is what I really see happening and unfolding in Isaiah chapter 64, which is our Old Testament reading for today. That the passage begins with this longing for God to come down, for God to rip open the heavens and come down, as we've heard about in times past, these mighty deeds of the Lord. Where are those now today? Lord, why won't you come down? Would that you would come down and do these things once more. But as the prophet Isaiah moves through this passage, what we see is a realization of what the real problem is. Not that God won't come down, but that we, God's people, have sinned. We have missed the mark. We have fallen short of the glory. We have refused to do as God's people have been taught. We failed to love God with our whole selves. We failed to love our neighbors as ourselves. We've even, at times, turned our neighbors into our enemies. And we've refused to let our enemies become our neighbors, thus ensuing that enmity will continue to reign. But by God's grace, Jesus promises us that our eyes are able to be opened, just as the prophets are opened. And when our sight is restored, we can come to see and have an honest appreciation of where we stand and what the issues really are. And we can come to see and trust and remember that God is our Father, and that our Father is the potter who is still wanting and working to shape and mold us into God's people. And when our sight is finally restored, when we begin to see, when our blindness is cured, a third dimension of hope begins to emerge, begins to become possible, and that is that we can begin to become partners with God in God's healing, transforming, redeeming work to shake up the world that we know. And the gospel is honest about this too. Not just that Jesus is coming to be with us as a babe in a manger, but that Jesus is coming to grow up and walk with us as a grown man, to walk with us, to show us the way, to blaze the trail, that we might walk where He has walked. And when we embrace that calling, when we are willing to follow after Jesus, what we see is that the dark side begins to be exposed, and not only exposed, it begins to fade in the light that is shone upon it. We begin to be able to listen truthfully and honestly to the prophets of the Old Testament, but also the prophets of our modern age. Prophets like Cheryl Bear, who was here in this very room, sharing of her pain and the pain of her people. It's one of the most memorable moments of my time here at Kingsway. For that pain was not only spoken, it was absorbed. And I know from talking with many of you, you left here that night changed because of the way that pain was received. That's a step toward the healing and the transformation of our world. Or other prophets, not even inside the church. Prophets like American intellectual and writer James Baldwin, who has in recent days become a prophet I've become tuned into. The intellectual voice of the civil rights movement back in my homeland, asking questions that I, as a person with white skin to this day, still need to answer. And when we hear and begin to take steps guided by our seeing and our hearing, we start to walk with people on the other side of that divide. And that's when the magic really begins to happen. Last night, another session of recess happened here at our church on this weekend, which marks World Disability Day. And once again, I was so moved and so touched at all the things that I saw, relationships being built, love being shown and demonstrated, bridges being crossed, divides being healed. And what a gift recess is for the families of our church and our community on both sides, those who give and those who receive. And that's when we really start to see hope take root and take bloom in our midst. When we are willing to walk with Jesus where he walked, to love God fully and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. But this third dimension of hope, this third step, requires a great deal of purpose and intentionality. And that's why we need to take Jesus' call to stay alert and keep awake seriously. There's a wonderful expression in Hebrew about what it means to be determined, to be set on something. And Luke uses this of Jesus as he's about to make his way to Jerusalem to face his destiny on the cross. Luke borrows this idiom for his Greek audience, and he says, Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. He fixed his gaze in that direction, on that purpose. And it's an expression that we see elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem and refused to be swayed, even though once he arrived, he was tempted, he felt weak. He prayed, God, let this cup pass from my lips if it is possible. But because he had set his face, he was able also to pray, but not my will, but thy will be done. And that is what's required of us, to fully embrace the hope that Advent offers, the hope that Jesus offers to us and to our world, to be healed and transformed as Jesus' disciples and as God's agents of hope, peace, joy, and love in this world, as God works to heal and transform the injustice of the fixed familiar order. And so as we begin our journey this Advent season, may we all fix our face on Bethlehem the way that Jesus fixed his face on Jerusalem. And may we stay alert and keep watch, for the Lord our God is on the move, and God calls us to join him on this journey. Thanks be to God. Amen.